My name is Cordelia, and at 28 years old, I was forcefully escorted out of the very corporate empire I spent 6 grueling years building from scratch. Bernie kept one hand firmly near my elbow, urging me forward, while Wallace raised a glass to his daughter through the break room window. Through the thick glass of the executive suite, my former boss smiled warmly at her, the company's new, utterly unqualified director, handing her the keys to my department in an act of pure, shameless nepotism. He looked right through me, his eyes dripping with condescension, and mouthed that she would finally clean up my mess. I didn't cry. I didn't make a scene. I just gripped my box of personal belongings tighter, keeping my rage tightly locked away. They called my life's work a mess, completely blind to the fact that the entire core architecture was custom built. They had absolutely no idea that my proprietary master files do not operate on standard corporate protocols. In exactly 48 hours, when the system requires its first root-level security validation, the entire infrastructure will realize I am gone. Less than 2 days from now, she will attempt to open those master files and trigger a catastrophic, irreversible system lockdown. I can already picture the sheer panic in their eyes. I know she will call me 19 times in a row, desperate for answers, but my phone will remain completely silent. They wanted me out, but they forgot that I hold the master key to their survival. Have you ever given your blood, sweat, and tears to a place, only to be betrayed by corrupt office politics and replaced by someone who didn't earn it? Before diving into the rest of my story, please let me know in the comments what time it is and which city you are watching this from, so I can see just how far my story has travelled. My name is Cordelia, and until less than an hour earlier, I was the one keeping an entire transit network from eating itself alive. While the upper executives spent their long afternoons sitting in climate-controlled boardrooms, signing vague policy updates, I sat in the dim light of the primary dispatch centre, managing real-time chaos. Every single municipal bus, emergency shuttle, university transfer point, and complex driver assignment relied completely on the digital framework I maintained. It was a thankless job. The sheer unpredictability of an urban transit infrastructure requires absolute precision because human behavior never conforms to a neat spreadsheet. Each distinct neighborhood across the metropolitan area has its own unique passenger flow, shifting dynamically based on economic factors and local employment schedules. Peak hours in the industrial district begin long before the first corporate commuters even open their eyes in the affluent suburbs. Managing this required constant vigilance. Furthermore, high-priority zones like the downtown hospital complex and major university campuses demand their own dedicated, heavily isolated routing protocols to prevent systemic gridlock. A single unexpected winter storm or a massive weekend sports event could instantly throw the entire regional grid into complete and utter devastation. My system handled all of it automatically. I lived for that complexity. I spent 3 long, exhausting years building that operational framework from the ground up, while the upper suite consistently stripped away my resources. Following 3 consecutive rounds of aggressive corporate downsizing, the board expected me to absorb the massive workload of an entire vanished department without a single dollar of extra compensation. My superior, Wallace, looked at my dedication not as a valuable asset to be rewarded, but as a free safety net for his own administrative incompetence. He loved squeezing people dry. Whenever a major routing crisis threatened our quarterly performance metrics, he would suddenly appear at my desk with wide, panicked eyes and beg me to fix the disaster before the board noticed. He always promised that my sacrifices would be formally recognized during the next annual review cycle, yet those promises dissolved the moment the immediate danger passed. I genuinely believed that my undeniable indispensability would serve as an impenetrable shield against any internal corporate scheming. I was incredibly naive. The subtle shifting of the corporate tides began approximately 6 months ago when a completely unannounced figure suddenly walked into our weekly operational briefing. Her name was Reese, and she was introduced to my core engineering team under the incredibly vague guise of providing fresh perspective and strategic administrative support. Wallace stood right beside her, beaming with an artificial, overly toothy grin that instantly sent a cold shiver of deep unease down my spine. The trap was set. He explicitly claimed her presence was merely a routine part of long-term leadership alignment and succession planning to ease my heavy operational burdens. She stood there, dressed in an impeccably tailored designer pantsuit, holding a brand new tablet and radiating the distinct, unmistakable aura of someone who had never stepped foot on a greasy maintenance depot floor. Her smile was completely hollow. She belonged in a boardroom. Within her very first week, she began using a dizzying array of sophisticated corporate buzzwords, constantly lecturing my veteran dispatchers about process standardization and synergistic workflow optimization. She spent countless hours designing beautifully colorful, highly polished digital dashboards that displayed completely useless, superficial performance metrics while contributing absolutely nothing to our actual daily logistical survival. She loved style over substance. I watched silently as she transformed simple, highly efficient operational reports into overcomplicated corporate presentations meant solely to impress the distant board of directors. It slowly became glaringly obvious that she was not there to support my heavily overworked department, but was instead being carefully groomed to steal the entire kingdom. Wallace was meticulously clearing the path for her. I felt the walls closing in. Closed-door strategy sessions soon became the standard routine, and I frequently noticed the heavy blinds of the executive office drawn tight while they conversed in low, hushed tones. My formal invitations to the weekly high-level budget allocations and long-term infrastructure planning meetings mysteriously began disappearing from my corporate digital calendar without any explanation. When I directly questioned my supervisor about these glaring omissions, he merely patted my shoulder condescendingly and told me to focus exclusively on the daily grind. They were freezing me out. During the rare moments when we actually shared a conference table, Reese would intentionally ask highly passive-aggressive, deeply undermining questions designed specifically to invalidate my years of practical, real-world experience. She would condescendingly wonder why we still relied on my customized algorithmic overrides instead of utilizing generic, off-the-shelf commercial software packages that looked prettier on her tablet. She openly despised my methods. I fiercely defended my architectural choices by explaining that standard commercial software could never handle the hyper-localized, chaotic realities of our city's unpredictable transit demands. I pointed out that my custom-coded master files adjusted to live traffic patterns, sudden weather shifts, and driver shortages in ways no generic program ever could. She would merely roll her eyes. Wallace would always nod along with her. Despite the glaring red flags multiplying around me every single day, I stubbornly chose to believe that my undeniable track record of flawless system stability would ultimately protect my position. I truly thought that no rational executive would ever be foolish enough to decapitate the technical heart of their own public transportation network just to satisfy a personal family favor. I overestimated their intelligence. Wallace was the true, calculation-driven villain of this entire corporate tragedy, operating with a cold, ruthless nepotism that completely disregarded the actual safety and efficiency of the public. Reese was merely the entitled, highly ambitious beneficiary of his corporate corruption, completely blind to her own immense technical incompetence and structural ignorance. They were a dangerous combination. As I walked out into the chilly afternoon air, carrying the heavy cardboard box containing my entire professional life, the numbing shock finally began to fade into a terrifyingly sharp, crystal-clear realization. The sudden, humiliating ambush inside his private office earlier that morning was not a reckless, impulsive decision fueled by a sudden disagreement over departmental direction. It was the calculated final step of a long, carefully orchestrated assassination of my career. They had planned this for months. The apartment sounded wrong that night, like every room had been waiting for me to come home with a reason. For years, I had poured my entire existence into balancing transit grids, treating my small living space as nothing more than a temporary pit stop between exhausting shifts. The complete absence of blinking monitors, radio hums, and emergency alerts felt suffocatingly heavy in the unfamiliar silence. It was absolutely deafening. Losing my position meant far more than merely missing a predictable bi-weekly corporate paycheck because my work had completely defined my personal identity. I had willingly sacrificed my weekends, my social life, and my mental well-being to ensure the city kept moving forward smoothly without an issue. Watching that deep dedication get erased by corporate politics left an empty, aching hollow inside my chest that text examples could never adequately describe. My purpose was gone. Throughout that long, agonizing first day of forced exile, my personal smartphone remained completely undisturbed on the kitchen counter. Not a single executive from the upper suite reached out to ask how I was doing or to offer any genuine, professional parting words. The absolute silence from the company confirmed my worst fears about how easily corporations discard human beings once their immediate utility is fully exhausted. I was forgotten. Meanwhile, back at the headquarters, the newly appointed director eagerly accepted full administrative privileges to my custom-built routing software platform. Wallace immediately began pressuring his daughter to simplify the entire network architecture, foolishly believing that my highly intricate overrides were just useless, overcomplicated decorations. He desperately wanted to prove to the board that his nepotism was actually a brilliant strategic decision. He wanted instant results. Reese completely believed she could easily re-engineer my operational framework by applying generic, rigid textbook theories of corporate process standardization. She viewed my dynamic, adaptive algorithms as messy anomalies that required urgent correction rather than essential defenses against real-world city chaos. The system did not collapse immediately because my embedded, automated safety protocols were still actively running quietly in the background. It was a ticking clock. The first subtle signs of systemic decay finally manifested 24 hours later when a private encrypted call bypassed my quiet phone's Do Not Disturb filter. It was Desmond, the veteran head of field operations, his voice trembling with an unmistakable mix of anxiety and deep frustration. He was the only colleague who still possessed enough integrity to contact me directly after my abrupt, humiliating termination. He needed my help. He rapidly informed me that several high-volume commuter express lines were already experiencing bizarre, completely unprecedented scheduling delays throughout the downtown core area. Emergency backup shuttles, which usually deployed automatically during minor traffic bottlenecks, were suddenly being misrouted to empty, low-priority suburban zones without clear explanation. Furthermore, 3 major transit transfer hubs had completely lost internal synchronization, causing dozens of passengers to miss vital connecting connections. Chaos was creeping in. To make matters worse, the complex master schedules for over 400 city bus drivers were suddenly beginning to collide aggressively with one another. Automated system dispatch tools were assigning multiple operators to the exact same physical vehicle while leaving other critical routes completely abandoned for hours. I listened to his frantic description and instantly understood that this was absolutely not a series of isolated software glitches. It was human error. The newly appointed leadership team had obviously begun touching my highly sensitive algorithmic overrides without understanding the deeply delicate urban context behind them. They were blindly altering complex variables on their colorful digital dashboards, treating a living, breathing municipal grid like a static school project. Every single superficial adjustment they made to make the spreadsheet look prettier was actually fracturing a vital layer of systemic stability. They were destroying it. The operational damage quickly escalated past the internal dispatch walls as public complaints began flooding the municipal service hotlines at an alarming rate. Mr. Colton, the notoriously ruthless executive director of the Regional Transit Authority, began launching fierce, highly aggressive inquiries into our declining performance metrics. He demanded immediate, concrete answers from my former boss regarding the sudden, embarrassing drop in our standardized on-time arrival percentages. The pressure was mounting. Wallace was reportedly spinning into a state of sheer, unadulterated panic inside his locked office, desperately trying to construct a believable corporate cover story. He tried to shift the blame onto external weather patterns and sudden, unpredictable equipment failures, but the Regulatory Oversight Committee refused to accept his weak excuses. They wanted the infrastructure fixed immediately, or they would threaten to revoke the entire company's lucrative municipal operating contract. His job was on the line. Inside my quiet apartment, I sat perfectly still on the couch, listening to the unfolding disaster while watching the afternoon sun slowly set. I carefully chose not to intervene, knowing full well that any premature advice from me would only allow them to escape their well-deserved consequences. They had confidently asserted that they could manage the entire framework better without my presence, and now they would have to face the music. I would remain silent. The situation inside the core tech department was decaying much faster than anyone on the outside could have possibly anticipated or predicted. Desmond lowered his voice to a cautious, anxious whisper, nervously checking over his shoulder to ensure nobody was monitoring his private call. He dropped a final, terrifying piece of analytical information that confirmed my most dangerous theories about their reckless desperation. They were crossing the line. He explicitly told me that his field team had just witnessed the new director attempting to bypass the primary security protocols. Reese was currently locked in the server room, desperately trying to force open my encrypted master files to reverse the growing transit gridlock. By the second morning, Reese had stopped pretending she understood what she was looking at. The illusion of her clean, aesthetic corporate dashboards dissolved completely the moment she bypassed the final security firewall and forced open my raw project files. Instead of neat, standardized charts, her screen became flooded with an incredibly dense labyrinth of active code. She was totally lost. Sprawled across her monitor were thousands of complex lines containing my highly customized dispatch override maps, critical emergency route notes, and dynamic rolling delay tables. She stared blankly at intricate transfer dependency sheets and deeply layered contingency frameworks designed specifically for severe weather, political protests, major road closures, and chaotic game nights. The sheer volume of non-standard operational variables was staggering. It was completely overwhelming. As she scrolled deeper into the system architecture, she noticed that identical delays on different transit routes were handled with completely unique, hyper-localized algorithmic solutions. A 10-minute bottleneck in the crowded industrial zone required an entirely different vehicle redirection strategy than a similar delay near the university campus. Instead of trying to understand the delicate logic behind these variations, she arrogantly decided to erase them. She wanted perfect symmetry. She immediately attempted to force a single, completely uniform set of standardized operational rules across the entire municipal network to clean up what she perceived as messy anomalies. She truly believed that streamlining my organic code into a rigid textbook structure would magically resolve the mounting transit friction. Unfortunately, that aggressive administrative action caused the delicate internal logic of the network to lose synchronization at an alarming speed. The system began fighting back. Meanwhile, Wallace was pacing frantically outside her glass office, putting an immense amount of pressure on her to fix the worsening situation before the board intervened. He repeatedly reminded her that her sudden promotion had to be justified immediately to prevent any suspicious rumors of executive nepotism from leaking out. He needed her to prove she could easily handle the department without my technical guidance. He demanded a total victory. He explicitly warned her that the External Oversight Committee was already demanding an emergency meeting regarding the sudden drop in public efficiency metrics. They could not afford to let the distant executive board discover that the internal dispatch operation was spinning into complete and utter devastation under her leadership. She had to fix the broken code immediately. Her confidence was utterly shattered. It was exactly 10:14 a.m. when my personal smartphone suddenly lit up on the kitchen island, displaying her name in bold letters across the vibrating screen. During those initial, frantic attempts to reach me, she still desperately tried to maintain her cold, condescending tone of superior corporate authority. Her voicemail messages demanded that I immediately walk her through my custom security parameters. I simply ignored them. As the afternoon progressed, the incoming alerts became significantly more frequent, shorter in duration, and noticeably more frantic as the transit crisis escalated across the city. The professional facade dropped completely, replaced by a raw, trembling panic that leaked through the digital receiver with every subsequent attempt. Over the span of 3 agonizing hours, her name flashed on my screen exactly 19 times. I never picked up once. I sat quietly on my balcony, watching the distant city skyline while the metallic device continuously buzzed against the hard wooden surface of the table. I remembered how confidently they had escorted me out of the building, completely certain that my years of practical experience could be easily replaced by a polished presentation. They had genuinely believed their own corporate lies. Now they were paying the price. While my phone continued its relentless vibration, a flurry of urgent text updates from Desmond arrived to paint a truly terrifying picture of the unfolding disaster. The main dispatch headquarters had degenerated into a state of absolute unmanageable chaos as the primary routing software began locking out local operators. Field workers were completely blind, the network was dying. Frantic bus drivers were being forced to idle at major intersections for over 45 minutes, desperately waiting for manual instructions that never came from the jammed control room. High-priority transit lines connecting the city's largest hospital complex to the dense residential areas were experiencing massive, catastrophic delays during the peak morning commute. Public outrage was boiling over. Reese was completely paralyzed by fear. She had reportedly locked herself inside the primary server room, weeping softly while staring at a blinking red error screen she had no idea how to resolve. The standard troubleshooting manuals she relied upon offered absolutely no solutions for a customized system that had been purposefully stripped of its primary architect. Her theoretical corporate strategies were completely useless against real-world mechanical failure. She had run out of options. Looking at the final missed notification on my screen, I slowly realized that the damage had officially breached the point of no return for the company. They had aggressively pushed the system far past its structural limits, blindly altering sensitive code until the entire database began eating itself alive from the inside out. No colorful slide deck or empty corporate buzzword could save them now. They were completely trapped in the dark. An hour after I put my phone face down on the kitchen counter, someone knocked like they already owned the building. The aggressive, echoing sound rattled through the small entryway, destroying the short-lived peace of my quiet living room. I slowly opened the heavy wooden door to find Wallace standing on the concrete doormat, his posture rigid and his hands shoved deeply into his overcoat pockets. He looked completely out of his depth. Reese stood slightly behind him, looking entirely different from the polished, impeccably tailored corporate executive who had smugly watched me carry my cardboard box out of the office. Her hair was messy, heavy dark circles stained the skin beneath her exhausted eyes, and her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a leather portfolio to her chest. She was fighting desperately to maintain her composure under the crushing weight of public scrutiny, but the raw stress was leaking through her facade. Her confidence had completely vanished. My former boss wasted absolutely no time, immediately launching into a highly practiced, professional speech about municipal duty and civic crisis. He spoke loudly about the collective responsibility we shared toward the city's stranded passengers and the critical necessity of keeping the public infrastructure moving forward safely. It was a masterfully crafted performance, designed to make his personal administrative disaster look like a shared humanitarian emergency. He sounded incredibly righteous. He smoothly transitioned into a financial proposal, offering me an astronomical independent consulting fee that amounted to nearly 4 times my previous bi-weekly operational salary. The hidden catch, however, was immediately transparent. I would return to the chaotic control room to resolve the system lockdown, while all formal authority and administrative credit remained firmly in his hands. He expected me to act as his silent savior. I just smiled coldly. I calmly stepped back into the doorway, refusing to allow his corporate buzzwords to deflect from the disgusting reality of what they had done. I explicitly pointed out that he had aggressively forced me out of my own department, solely to install his utterly unqualified daughter into a position she never earned. There had been absolutely no formal knowledge transfer, no respectful transition period, and no genuine appreciation for the years of sacrifice I had poured into that network. They had made their bed. They had loudly labelled my organic, custom-coded infrastructure an unmanageable mess during my humiliating termination, and yet here they were, begging for my intervention 48 hours later. They only cared about responsibility when their own high-paying executive positions were being actively threatened by a furious oversight committee and a hostile public. Wallace opened his mouth to offer a slick rebuttal, but his daughter suddenly cut him off with a sharp gasp. She could no longer pretend. Reese stepped forward, her voice cracking slightly, as she openly admitted for the very first time that she could not comprehend a single line of my core architecture. Her theoretical corporate training and colourful presentation slides had proven completely useless against the organic, deeply non-standard reality of my live transit algorithms. Her initial, deeply rooted arrogance had completely transformed into a terrifyingly real, uncontrollable panic as the municipal grid locked up. She was completely broken. She finally understood that her calculating father had recklessly pushed her into a dangerous, highly technical trap just to satisfy a toxic family favor. He had promised her an easy, highly prestigious directorship, completely ignoring the immense engineering responsibility required to keep an entire metropolitan network from eating itself alive. She looked at me with wide, desperate eyes that silently begged for a lifeline. She was drowning in complexity. Seeing his daughter's composure dissolve so completely, Wallace's artificial warmth immediately vanished, replaced by a dark, chillingly sharp shift in his tone. He shifted seamlessly from a desperate corporate beggar to a soft, deeply manipulative villain, whispering that a total systemic failure would permanently ruin my professional reputation. He softly insinuated that my stubborn refusal to cooperate made me personally responsible for every single stranded commuter in the city. He tried to weaponize my guilt. He coolly reminded me that the Regional Transit Authority would blackball my name from the entire public sector if I allowed this high-profile disaster to continue escalating. I looked him directly in his cold, calculating eyes and felt absolutely nothing but a deep, unshakable sense of calm satisfaction. His empty threats and corporate manipulation no longer held any power over my identity. I was completely untouchable. I calmly but firmly refused to step foot back inside his chaotic headquarters under his manipulative, lopsided terms. I clearly stated that I would eventually help the Transit Authority stabilize the network, but I would absolutely never lift a single finger to shield him from his well-deserved consequences. He had created this catastrophic organizational disaster through his own corrupt nepotism, and now he would have to explain the collapse to Mr. Colton himself. His empire was crumbling. He stood frozen on the landing, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage as he realized his power over me had completely evaporated. He tried to speak, but the sheer realization that he could neither buy my silence nor terrify me into submission left him completely speechless. The corporate predator had finally run out of moves. He looked utterly defeated. Reese turned away first, her shoulders slumping heavily as she began walking slowly down the carpeted hallway toward the exit. For the very first time in her pampered life, she saw her father not as an all-powerful, untouchable corporate master who could fix any problem with a phone call, but as a small, desperate man who had completely lost control of the situation. The illusion of his absolute protection was shattered permanently. She walked away in silence. I left the apartment before noon and went downtown because I needed to see what their decisions looked like on actual sidewalks. Walking into the heart of the city's primary business district felt like stepping directly into a slow-motion logistical disaster zone. Hundreds of frustrated commuters were crowded onto the concrete islands of the central transfer point, checking their wristwatches with aggressive, impatient gestures. The city was freezing. Nearby, a row of long municipal buses sat completely idle against the curb, while their visibly stressed operators stared blankly at their internal navigation terminals. The automated dispatch system was transmitting vital routing updates at an incredibly sluggish pace, forcing operators to wait indefinitely for basic authorization commands. Further down the platform, a dedicated medical shuttle reserved specifically for elderly patients was already 45 minutes late for its scheduled pickup. Vulnerable citizens were abandoned. A young mother stood near the regional information kiosk, desperately trying to comfort her crying child, while balancing 2 heavy grocery bags on her arms. She had just missed her second consecutive vehicle connection due to the uncoordinated, completely broken timing cycles of the regional loop framework. The systemic delays were cascading across the entire urban network, turning a minor internal database error into a full-scale civic crisis. People were suffering. This devastating scene instantly triggered a fierce, highly painful moral conflict within my chest as I watched the infrastructure slowly dissolve into complete anarchy. I knew with absolute certainty that I owed absolutely nothing to my former boss or his incompetent family after the way they humiliated me. Yet, the innocent working-class citizens of this city were the ones actively paying the price for his greedy corporate corruption. The burden felt heavy. A sharp buzz from my pocket interrupted my racing thoughts, revealing a brief, highly alarming internal message from my trusted ally in dispatch. Desmond rapidly reported that my former boss was already spinning a toxic corporate narrative to shield his department from immediate termination. Wallace was loudly claiming during emergency executive panels that my custom-built platform was purposefully coded to be completely impossible to hand over. He was transferring blame. To make matters worse, his panicked daughter was currently being groomed by the marketing department to act as the calming public face of the crisis. Reese was scheduled to deliver a televised municipal press briefing within the hour to reassure furious city council members that everything was under control. They were shamelessly using superficial corporate public relations tactics to mask a total structural failure of the network. They were still lying. Just as I locked my screen in disgust, an entirely unexpected, highly formal notification popped up from a private encrypted email address. The message was signed by Harriet Vance, the fiercely independent, longest-serving senior chairperson on our company's executive board of directors. She explicitly requested an immediate, highly confidential face-to-face meeting at a quiet corporate boardroom located just 3 blocks away from my current position. The game was changing. The atmospheric tone of that private meeting was completely devoid of personal sentimentality, operating entirely on the cold, precise language of high-stakes corporate risk management. Harriet sat behind a polished mahogany table, her eyes sharp and alert as she immediately opened a digital folder containing active service failure metrics. She wasted no time on empty pleasantries, driving the conversation straight into legal contract exposure and severe regulatory reporting penalties. She needed direct answers. She quietly confessed that my former boss had presented a completely fabricated internal report to the board when he originally orchestrated my abrupt termination. Wallace had confidently assured the high-level decision-makers that my position had simply become redundant due to his daughter's advanced administrative capabilities. Harriet had been kept completely in the dark regarding the hyper-localized, highly sensitive algorithmic framework required to maintain the transit grid. She was genuinely furious. I calmly opened my personal tablet and began presenting a comprehensive structural breakdown of the entire custom-coded public transportation network. I explicitly demonstrated why a generic, rigid set of standard corporate rules could never absorb the volatile, real-time, chaotic realities of our metropolitan traffic patterns. I clearly outlined how his reckless administrative interference had directly triggered the catastrophic database lockdown currently paralyzing the downtown loop. The evidence was undeniable. Furthermore, I mathematically proved that installing his completely inexperienced daughter into the primary engineering seat constituted a massive conflict of interest. Her total structural ignorance had turned a highly stable, flawless municipal asset into an incredibly dangerous legal liability for the entire corporate board. Harriet listened in intense, stony silence, her fingers tapping rhythmically against the wooden table as the full scope of the deception became clear. The truth was out. I looked directly across the table at the powerful board member and firmly laid out my strict, completely non-negotiable conditions for any future intervention. First, my former boss had to be immediately and permanently removed from any direct operational command or administrative oversight over my department. Second, every single internal communication and system modification moving forward had to be documented with absolute structural transparency for the oversight board. I demanded full compliance. Finally, my massive technical contributions to the stability of the municipal grid had to be formally and permanently recognized in writing by the executive committee. I made it beautifully clear that I would absolutely never return to the headquarters as a regular, submissive employee working under his corrupt shadow. I was an independent force now. Harriet stared at me for a long moment, evaluating my unshakable resolve. The veteran corporate chairperson did not falsely promise an immediate, total victory right there in the quiet room, but her sharp nod spoke volumes. She quietly explained that an extraordinary emergency meeting of the entire executive board was scheduled to take place in exactly 45 minutes. She carefully packed her digital materials, her face hardened by a calculated, cold determination to protect the company's multi-million-dollar municipal contract. The stage was set. The executive floor had that polished kind of silence that usually meant someone was about to lose control of a room. Inside the grand, glass-walled conference chamber, the atmosphere felt incredibly tense as the senior decision-makers sat rigidly around the massive boardroom table. Wallace stood confidently at the head of the long table, clearing his throat loudly before clicking open an elaborate, heavily rehearsed digital slide presentation. He began speaking immediately. He aggressively opened his defense by smoothly shifting the narrative, loudly claiming that the current transit gridlock was caused by an unsustainable architectural flaw. He argued that the entire regional infrastructure had become dangerously dependent on a single individual's rigid, uncooperative operational methodology instead of industry-standard protocols. He coolly insinuated that the framework I built over 6 years lacked the basic technical flexibility required for a modern enterprise environment. He was projecting his failure. His daughter sat directly to his right, serving as a silent, heavily dressed piece of physical evidence for his long-term succession planning strategy. Reese looked noticeably paler under the harsh fluorescent lighting of the boardroom, her eyes locked onto her closed leather portfolio to avoid eye contact. She looked entirely like someone who had just realized she was standing on an active landmine about to explode. The tension was building. Just as my former boss prepared to transition into his next superficial slide deck, Harriet suddenly raised her hand to interrupt his presentation. Her voice sliced through the polished room with a cold, terrifyingly sharp precision that immediately froze the breathing of every executive present. She pulled up a secure, highly confidential analytical document on her own monitor and looked directly across at the standing manager. She began her dismantling. She forcefully demanded to know exactly who approved this abrupt executive personnel transition without executing a standardized, legally binding handoff protocol. She icily asked who had formally verified that the incoming director possessed the advanced architectural certification required to manage a live municipal grid. Furthermore, she openly questioned who had authorized the false internal reports, stating that the department was operating at peak administrative readiness. Wallace began to sweat. Before he could construct a clever corporate defense, Harriet seamlessly introduced live telemetry logs provided directly by our veteran field operations division. Desmond's detailed technical reports explicitly proved that the catastrophic system errors only manifested after my sudden, unceremonious forced departure from the company. The data clearly demonstrated that the current operational collapse was a direct consequence of reckless, unauthorized administrative interference with my master files. The numbers did not lie. Mr. Colton sat at the opposite end of the mahogany table, his heavy face twisted into an expression of deep, unadulterated professional fury. He leaned forward aggressively, reminding the panicked board members that his regional transit authority did not care about internal corporate power struggles. His municipal oversight committee only cared about active contract compliance, escalating public outrage, and the immediate financial penalties of massive service failures. He demanded a sacrifice. He loudly stated that the City Council was already prepared to terminate our multi-million-dollar contract if the grid was not restored by morning. Harriet nodded coldly in absolute agreement before turning her sharp, unyielding gaze away from the father and locking it onto the daughter. She ignored the manager entirely, directing a devastatingly straightforward, highly clinical series of questions directly toward the trembling new director. She went for the heart. She directly demanded to know if Reese had genuinely understood a single line of the live dispatch logic before accepting the high-paying position. She asked if her father had truthfully explained that this specific role required years of intense, real-world grit on a greasy maintenance floor. Finally, she asked if she had simply accepted the title because she believed her family connections made her completely untouchable. The room held its breath. Reese remained frozen for several long, suffocating seconds, her fingers tightly clutching the edge of the table until her knuckles turned completely white. She tried to speak, but her initial sentences came out as broken, highly defensive corporate fragments about process optimization and workflow standardization. Under Harriet's unwavering clinical gaze, her superficial vocabulary collapsed entirely, and she was forced to admit her total technical inadequacy. She softly stammered her confession. She haltingly confessed that she could not decipher the non-standard security parameters or the complex algorithmic overrides contained within my encrypted core master files. She admitted that she had underestimated the immense mechanical complexity of the regional transport network, assuming her corporate training would protect her. This painful, stuttering breakdown shattered the carefully constructed illusion of her administrative capability right before the eyes of the entire executive board. The deception was complete. Her sudden, highly visible public collapse immediately triggered an explosive, completely unhinged reaction from her father at the head of the table. Wallace lost his polished corporate composure entirely, shouting that his daughter was being unfairly targeted by an organized internal political conspiracy. He frantically tried to reassert his authority over the room, but his wild gestures and desperate tone only exposed his complete vulnerability. Nobody was listening anymore. By prioritizing nepotism over verified technical competence, he had single-handedly transformed a flawless municipal asset into a massive, multi-million-dollar legal liability. He had minimized the extreme operational risks of his personal ambitions, blindly believing he could always manipulate the final narrative to the board. The powerful members of the executive committee stared at him with cold, disgusted expressions that signaled the end of his career. He was totally isolated. Harriet slowly closed her digital folder, the sharp, decisive sound signaling the absolute conclusion of his administrative reign over the department. My former supervisor stood completely silent under the heavy, judgmental silence of the room, his chest heaving as he realized his power was gone. He looked around the long mahogany table, but every single board member purposefully turned their eyes away from his desperate, pleading gaze. He had officially lost control. By the time the week turned, nobody inside that company was calling it a transition anymore. The absolute destruction of our operations demanded an immediate, ruthless organizational restructuring that left no room for political maneuvering or empty corporate promises. Harriet wasted absolutely no time executing the emergency mandates established by the executive board during their closed-door crisis panel. The clean sweep began. She immediately stripped Wallace of his formal title, permanently revoking his administrative command over the Network Operations Division and locking his database access. A rigorous, highly aggressive internal investigation into severe corporate conflict of interest was officially launched by a third-party regulatory compliance team. They scrutinized the complete absence of a standardized knowledge transfer protocol and the intentional falsification of departmental readiness reports. The evidence was overwhelming. The financial and professional consequences for my former superior were utterly devastating and grounded in hard, undeniable corporate reality. He was completely stripped of his lucrative annual performance bonuses and quietly forced to sign an immediate, non-negotiable resignation agreement before the week ended. There was no celebratory retirement gathering, no public thank you announcement, and no comfortable corporate exit package to cushion his fall. He left in total disgrace. His daughter suffered an equally definitive, completely unglamorous professional downfall as the board thoroughly dismantled his corrupt legacy. Reese was immediately stripped of her unearned program lead title, and her highly restricted technical access privileges were completely terminated. The executive committee did not offer her a secondary, less demanding administrative position to save her family's social reputation. She simply vanished from the organization. The Regional Transit Authority completely bypassed the broken internal management hierarchy, choosing to collaborate exclusively through a newly formed oversight infrastructure. I agreed to stabilize the chaotic municipal transport grid under a highly specific, strictly independent consulting contract that operated completely outside their standard corporate employment rules. My custom-coded algorithms were safely restored, and the cascading delays across the downtown loop finally dissolved into smooth, predictable arrival metrics. The city was moving again. Throughout this entire intense stabilization process, I stubbornly refused to offer them even a single ounce of personal reconciliation or comfort. I did not agree to any soft, friendly coffee meetings to clear the air, nor did I accept their awkward, desperate corporate apologies. I deliberately chose a cold, beautifully clean separation from their entire toxic sphere because it was the only way to protect my professional boundaries. Some bridges deserve to burn. Our professional landscape frequently values superficial connections over actual technical mastery, but this crisis proved that relationship networks can never replace true, raw competence. Entitled family ties can easily hand someone a highly prestigious executive seat, but they cannot give them the field-tested intelligence required to maintain an empire. When an organization treats its highest value creators like disposable, easily replaceable cogs, that system will inevitably collapse under its own ignorance. Merit always triumphs eventually. Walking away from a corrupt workplace environment is not an act of bitter cruelty, It is the ultimate form of self-preservation. Realizing your true professional worth means refusing to allow your specialized knowledge to be weaponized by manipulative managers who only remember your name during an operational disaster. You must protect your own value. I want to extend my deepest, most sincere gratitude to every single one of you who stayed with me until the very end of this journey. I hold an immense amount of respect for anyone out there who has ever experienced the crushing pain of being minimized and exploited in their own career. Your dedication is real, your skills are valuable, and your contributions matter far more than the temporary opinions of a corrupt boss. You are not alone. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would absolutely love to hear your personal thoughts and unique experiences regarding office politics in the comments section below. Please share your insights so we can continue supporting each other as an empowering professional community. Let me know how you fought back.